Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Courageous Conversations about our schools. I'm your host, Ken Federnick, and today is October 25th, 2024, and it's just 11 days before what promises to be one of the closest and most consequential presidential elections in our lifetime. If you're listening to this podcast 30, 40 years from now, I'll just remind you that at the top of the ballot is former President Donald Trump and the current Vice President Kamala Harris. In a recent survey conducted by the weekly publication Edweek, most teachers have not been talking about the presidential election in their classrooms. Some of those teachers who participated in the survey acknowledged that politics was simply unrelated to their subject areas, but others said it was because of the possibility of parent complaints. 19% of the people in the survey said it was because, quote, they didn't believe their students can discuss this topic with one another in a respectful manner. It would seem like schools would be the perfect place for students to talk about and learn about the election and to use their critical thinking skills to analyze and talk with each other about what the candidates are saying, and to be able to distinguish between credible information they see on the internet from the misinformation that we all know is rampant. I would like to think these skills would also serve them well after the election, when there's sure to be protests and claims and counterclaims about election fraud and tampering. So today, my guests and I are going to be speaking about whether the fact that many teachers are simply avoiding the subject is a problem, and if it is, what to do about it. So let's meet those who will be part of this conversation. First, let me welcome Chris Kuleza. Chris, say a bit about what you do and where you live.
Thanks so much for having me on. So my name is Dr. Chris Kulesza. I am a scholar at the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University, where I study child health and the social determinants of health in K through 12 education. And I'm also the national committeeman for Texas for the Young Republicans. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, great. I'm glad you're here, Chris. Next, I want to welcome Jordanos Lemma. Jordanos, so glad you could join us. You recently graduated from high school, I know, and you're now a freshman at USC in Los Angeles. Tell our listeners where you grew up and what you're studying at USC.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jordanos Lemma. I currently am a freshman at USC studying history on a pre-law track. I am originally from the greater Philadelphia area, and a little bit of what I did back home was educational equity work, and I led a group of students where we had a group of students from traditionally overlooked backgrounds, and we were able to give them tools and anything necessary to succeed. And this was through giving them the tools needed to advocate for themselves, to be advocates in the future. And this was through leadership trainings, racial literacy workshops, and overall just making sure that they understood what being a leader was.
Great. Well, you're well suited to be weighing in on these questions for today. And next, I want to welcome Rafael Struve. Rafael, I hope I pronounced your last name correctly. You, like Christopher, are also from Texas, isn't that right?
Yes, sir. That is correct. And you did, in fact, pronounce my last name correctly. So congratulations. Thank you for that.
I'm sensitive to that because I get all kinds of mispronunciations of my name. I had to live with it all my life. I bet you've gotten a few yourself.
Oh yeah, yes sir, absolutely. But no harm, no foul. Not a problem in any case. I, like Chris, am based here in Houston. Like Chris, I am actually I'm a graduate of a program from Rice University from the Baker Institute where Chris actually works. And like Chris, I am also with the Texas Young Republicans. I actually serve right now as the president of the Houston chapter, so the Houston Young Republicans. Apart from that, I'm also, in terms of civic engagement, involved with an organization called Bienvenido. Bienvenido is an organization that is dedicated to amplifying Hispanic voices on the right side of the aisle, let's say, with engagement in different areas, whether they be in faith, whether they be in business, or whether they just be in civic education.
Terrific. Thanks for being with us today. And finally, I'm really pleased to welcome Stephanie Shonikin. Stephanie, Dr. Shonikin, I would like you to let our listeners know about your work and where you live.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Shonacon. I am the Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities and a professor of ethnomusicology at the University of Maryland. I am here not as dean, but I am here as a co-author with my dear friend Adam Seagrave, who is unfortunately not able to join us, but he and I collaborated on a book called Race and the American Story, which we produced while we were at the University of Missouri. And lots of things happened there. So, as an ethnomusicologist who studies art and culture, and then Adam as a political scientist, we collaborated on I think, an interdisciplinary project that looked at race and the American story. So, excited to be here and to talk as a scholar, not as a representative of my university.
Thanks for being here, and we're sorry that your colleague Adam Seagraves couldn't be here. I'll put a link in our episode notes to the book so people, if they're interested in looking into that, they can. Okay, well, let's talk about the upcoming election and whether teachers should be talking about it with their students, not just in the remaining days before it happens, but in the coming months when things are likely to become even more contentious. And let me just go in reverse order. Stephanie, if you would just share a few thoughts about the question that I posed today. Should teachers be talking about it? And are you concerned if they're not? And do you have some thoughts about what we can do if you think that there should be more discussion and the students should be feeling a bit safer or a little bit more civil with each other when they have these conversations?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I do feel for the teachers. I understand how difficult it is to moderate conversations in the classroom that could get contentious. I've been teaching for many, many years, and I do remember the first year I taught college and how difficult it was even then to moderate a discussion in a college class, not let alone a high school class or earlier. So I do understand that. I think what I'll say in answer to the question is that I believe it is more important for these classrooms, these teachers, and their students to understand the context for why these conversations right now are so difficult. What is the context for the quick tweets and or I don't know what you call them now. They're not tweets anymore. They're X's or something. But what is the context? What is under these very quick and polarizing declarations that make the news? Why are leaders saying these things? What is the history that leads us to this place? I think that's the most important thing. So I do think it's difficult for a teacher to talk about the elections when they're not allowed to talk about the context that leads us to this place at this time.
Thank you, Stephanie. Raphael, your thoughts on this question, and are you concerned about teachers not talking about these things? I would think, given your work in civics, you have some concern about it.
I do, yes. So I have not had a chance to see this sort of thing up front in recent time, but what I will say is that I did spend some time as a tutor several years ago and as early as last year. And one of the concerns that I had, yes, was when I would engage with a student of mine who was it was a history course, and I think one of the concerns that I have is sometimes you're right that there is kind of a fear of backlash when it comes to teachers trying to engage, whether it be from administrators, whether it be from parents, whether it be from students themselves. I think, as Stephanie mentioned earlier, now everything can be dissected, can be put into a viral moment, and that ends up doing more harm than good. But at the same time, if students don't see that kind of modeled dialogue, that back and forth constructive disagreement in the classroom, where else are they going to learn it? I think that teachers have a duty not only to foster that kind of environment, but also ensure that they themselves check their emotions at the door.
Thank you for that, Raphael. Jordanis, you're recently, as I mentioned earlier, graduated from high school. You're studying history at USC. I'm really eager to hear your thoughts on this question about teachers, in some cases, avoiding the subject altogether out of fear of backlash from parents.
Yeah, so I agree with what both Stephanie and Raphael said. I think that when it's important to compare what civic dialogue looks like on social media, if you could even call it that, versus what it looks like in a classroom. And it's so important to see that on social media, we aren't able to really dissect and see the nuances between every perspective that is shown in the election. And I think on social media, we're able to make these quick points and these quick talking points that are very destructive and dangerous in many ways. And when students are seeing that, they aren't really able to understand their own view, but then at the same time, not really understand other people's perspectives and really see where they're coming from. And I think if we're able to shift that and have these civic discussions and these civic discourses in a classroom where teachers are able to facilitate and also be a part of these uncomfortable discussions, we're able to grow as individuals and see people's humanity. And that's something that is missing from social media. And students, when they're able to finally humanize other people's perspectives and see that at the end of the day, it's another person and that it's their classmate, it's their friend, it's their family, then they're able to see that it's okay to be in these discussions and it's okay to actually have them because we'll grow as individuals. And I think something that has made my perspective a little bit unique is that in high school I was able to get involved in these type of discussions and be in civic discourse and civic discussions with people who've experienced this and have already done this work, and I've been able to grow as a person because of that. And if we're able to bring conversations like this into classrooms, I think students have so much to learn, and teachers.
Jordanis, I'm just curious, in your high school and university experience, you've only, been at UC a few months now, but do you generally find that students are able to feel free to express their perspectives about issues and candidates and without fear that they're going to be shamed or criticized by others?
A lot of times in these situations, I feel like echo chambers can be created. And I think either whether it's a liberal perspective or a conservative perspective, these echo chambers can make it super hard for students from certain backgrounds to open up about their perspectives. And I think it's the responsibility, not completely of the teacher, but I think responsibility of administration as well to make sure that these classrooms are open spaces where multiple perspectives are allowed to be discussed. And I think in my own experience, I had one teacher in my junior year that was very open about discussing politics and current events. And there were so many people who brought up new perspectives that they had never brought up in previous classes. And it was very interesting to see how they have so much more nuanced viewpoints and so much more nuanced politics. And it's important to see that, and that teacher being able to open up the conversation and feeling comfortable in their own viewpoint. They were able to show us that it's okay to have these discussions in classrooms.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jordanis. Chris, how about you? What are your thoughts about these questions?
It is really unfortunate that we're not able to have these conversations as openly as we would like to during these school years, especially considering that these are very important formative years. We really want to have education not just be learning the test or learning the books, but be able to develop a whole child that wants to be an active part of the civic sphere. And we are harming that as we end up making the school environment more toxic when it comes to talking about politics. But unfortunately, it really isn't too surprising. And something that I wanted to expand upon, we were talking about context. For one, there's the context, the fact that we can't understand the context as to where we are politically because of the curriculum, but also we have to understand the context for which the teachers are operating under. More and more so, the school boards are becoming politicized. We are seeing at school board meetings much more attention and much more focus because we're living, of course, in a more polarized world. Different reasons for that. We are living now in areas that are more likely to agree with our political ideals, and we are only looking at news that conforms to our political ideals. So there's all of this pressure now on school boards to effectively mimic the politics of where they're living rather than meeting the educational objectives. And teachers and administrators, of course, are very concerned about having to respond to that. The thing is, too, is that teachers are pressured, again, when it comes to the curriculum, to teach the test in some cases and to stick to very specific outlines and guidelines that don't necessarily include the context for where we are politically and doesn't really necessarily include things like civic engagement. So ultimately, at the end of the day, we need to be able to give teachers the tools to be able to have these conversations in the classroom. But unfortunately, there isn't necessarily the ability or the will in many areas to be able to do something like that. But yet there are many tools out there that research has shown can really facilitate good discussion, but they're not always available for teachers to draw upon.
All right. Well, thanks. You sort of set the stage, and I want to come back to something that a couple of you said about the context. And I think one context that comes to my mind that underlies this problem is what came out in this Ed Week survey, which is teachers who don't talk about it are concerned that there's going to be pushback and criticism from parents. So the context is, and it's sort of taking off on what you were alluding to, Chris, which is there's this eroding levels of trust among parents about teachers. So my question to all of you is if you could imagine yourself being a high school or university history teacher or civics teacher, and you want to talk about the election, it's certainly a relevant topic. What might you do to build confidence with parents? Now, at the university level, it's very difficult. The parents really aren't in the picture like they are in high school. But in high school, if you imagine you're a high school history teacher, what do you think you could do, or a history teacher could do to sort of strengthen the levels of trust with you and the parents of your students? Well, let me start with you, Raphael.
Yeah, that's a really great question, Ken. So I think that I had a really good experience as a tutor because while I was never actually a teacher myself, having these one-on-one conversations, I think obviously gave me a big advantage because the peer pressure was not there, right? I think that it was easier for me to facilitate communication in a way where I was able to very patiently foster, I think, this sort of mentality where nuances, as mentioned earlier, are appreciated, and where I'm coming in, checking my emotions at the door, checking my own biases at the door, in order to constructively speak about issues and providing two different sides of a perspective. Something that I did when I was actually a tutor, this is just my most recent example, when we had to talk about issues like gun rights, or when we had to talk about issues like the extent to which the government should have more control or exercise measures of more taxation. I would go to a website like ProPublica, which gives these issues on both, I guess, from a yes and no perspective, and with cited sources to back up their evidence. That's just, I guess, one of the several examples that I used when I was a tutor, and I was I was faced with that sort of challenge. I think that when it comes to being an actual teacher, what the most important thing is to ensure that the teachers understand that what you're trying to do is, number one, you don't want to enable an environment where students come into the classroom and because of what they see on TikTok or what they see on social media, that they're having to win or defend a side as opposed to actually listening to what the other person has to say. I think Giordano made a really, really good point earlier that I see this on both sides of the political spectrum, that conversations have been sort of whittled down to who is the loudest and who can sort of slam dunk on the other side the hardest. And that is not conducive to the actual kind of learning that needs to take place about not necessarily the who, the what, the where, but the why. So if the teacher can just set the tone by emphasizing that the goal isn't to win a debate, but to have a conversation, understand where someone else is coming from, even if you don't agree, I think that it at least puts doubts, concerns, fears to rest for the parents, knowing that at the very least, the teacher has the best interests of the student in mind in that regard.
Yeah, I think you allude to something that I think is really important, that sometimes we enter into conversation or classroom conversations or even with our friends with the idea that our job is to win the debate, which is not the same thing as learning. So you look for mistakes in what the other person is saying, or you shout louder than they do, all thinking that the purpose of that is to come away thinking and having other people think that you won. But in a classroom, the point of schools is to learn, and you do that through what you alluded to is by listening. And as soon as you try to shut down other people, they're not necessarily going to share with you what they would want to share. Stephanie, how about you? What can teachers do? And I realize that you're at the college level, but you know about high school and you know about elementary school. What can teachers do to build trust and restore confidence that they're not trying to indoctrinate or try to get their students to think like they do?
Yeah, no, I think I really appreciated Raphael's notions of checking our biases at the door and showing that. I think it's really important that as much as we can do it, we're humans, so we all come in with our worldviews and so on. That's the truth. But it's our responsibility to make the effort and be intentional about putting that aside. It's something I say to all the professors here in my college, which is, our job is to teach these wonderful students who want to become great citizens of the world, and so how can we do that without bringing our own bias in? I will answer the question by using an example again from what Adam and I did at the University of Missouri. We found it was really helpful, and we became great friends and collaborators right after a significant movement at the University of Missouri in 2015. And the campus was very tense. People and their parents were very suspicious of anything that was coming out of the University of Missouri. So we created a program where students could come into a classroom and read everything, not just one side, but read primary sources that had not been commented on, rather giving our students a chance to read for themselves, the Declaration of Independence or the draft of the Declaration and the Constitution, and then speeches and so on after that. It was important for our students to get that firsthand view instead of reading and processing through other scholars' views. I think that's a really that turned out to be a very effective way of getting students who were on the left and the right to sit in a classroom and just process together. And then I think team teaching was is something that I would highly recommend. When students come into a classroom and they see Adam and myself, he's a white man and I am who I am, right? So I think it's also important to model for the students what a dis debate can look like that is respectful, grounded in scholarship. And again, neither of us have to win, but we at least are on the same ground when it comes to helping our students navigate to their own epiphanies about the world that they're living in. So those are the two things that I would put out as I think examples of what teachers might be able to do. But again, I say this without being in the high school or the K-12 class. I'm at the college. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I sometimes think about what Amanda Ripley has written about and talks about. She's someone I've interviewed. She's the author of a book called High Conflict, and she's one of the country's leading experts on conflict and polarization and how we lessen and bridge our divides. But she says it's really not about no conflict. It's about healthy conflict. And what you alluded to, Stephanie, is modeling the kind of debates between you and Adam before your students that show that you can disagree. And not only can you're willing to, you embrace that, but it's the way that you do it and your willingness to say, oh, you brought up a good point I hadn't thought about. I need to think about that. Or we're going to have to just agree to disagree for now, but thank you for that's healthy debate. And sometimes in this bridging work, this courageous conversations work of depolarizing people assume that we're just trying to, and that's what concerns me is that teachers are saying, you know what, I'm just not going to have we're not going to talk about the presidential election. That'll solve it. And I don't know that they actually think it'll solve it, but it's more comfortable to do that than to try to engage with your class. Like, what are you thinking about? Are you with your students? Are you who are you thinking might win and why? And who are you drawn to if you're willing to share that? And can we have that conversation in a way where we learn from each other? And that's that. It's troubling to me that the direction we're headed in is less conflict, no conflict, rather than healthy conflict. I want to share a story from a podcast interview I did a couple of years ago with a teacher named Tracy Barnett. She's a history teacher at a middle school in Fremont, California. And I had her on and her principal, a guy named Corey Brown. And the principal was there to say that Tracy would teach history very honestly. She, as the times became more contentious and some of these subjects became more volatile, she didn't change her curriculum or teaching at all. And the reason he supported her in teaching what she called honest history is that she had always made a concerted effort to communicate with her parents. Here's my curriculum. Here's what I'm trying to accomplish. She invited parents to come in to certain, anytime during her class, but certain times during the year to witness what kids were talking about and invited them to come in and share concerns that they had them. The principal said he never got a single complaint from a parent because and she's a progressive minded teacher, but in working in a fairly conservative community in California, never had any complaints at all. And he attributed it to the trust that he had established with parents by being transparent and open and saying, this is what we are doing. This is why we're doing it. And I think the kids probably came home and never complained that Miss Barnett was trying to indoctrinate them or force them to think one way or the other. And so I think there's something about that, making it clearer to parents. And even at the college level to students, our goal here is not for me to try to get you to think like me, is to get you to think and to communicate effectively with other people and respectfully with other people in this class. So we're going to sort of draw this to a close, I really appreciate all of you weighing in on these important questions. Before signing off, I want to just share a personal note about the weeks and months ahead, as I'm concerned about it, as I'm sure you are as well. And I want to invite you, if you have a thought that you want to share with our listeners before we sign off about the weeks and months ahead post-election. Here's my personal note. This election will likely be very close, and there will be and already are allegations of election interference, tampering, and fraud. There will undoubtedly be lawsuits. We will be bombarded with misinformation, disinformation, and deepfakes. There's a good chance this will add fuel to our already divided communities, not just in schools, but in our families. Our democracies, all democracies, are fragile. If ours is to survive, we have to find ways to rise up above the rancor, to be civil, to honor our humanity, and to be good models for our children, and to promote unity regardless of the outcome of the election. So I just want to invite each of you, if you have something that you want to share, just a note for what you hope for in the coming weeks and months. Just if you would raise your hand, and I'll call on you if you have one to share. Stephanie?
Thank you, Ken. This is such a great question. It's a hopeful one, and I appreciate that you are asking us to imagine, right, what could be. So I'll just say two quick things. One is that, as you all can tell from my accent, I'm not from around here. I've been in this country for just under 30 years, but I didn't grow up here. When I grew up across the world, on the other side of the world, we looked towards the United States as a great democracy, a place where people could go to the polls, they could vote. Those votes were hard fought for, right? There were groups of people in this country that couldn't vote for decades and centuries, and at this point, such progress that we have gotten to. So as I was growing up watching the United States, I just thought, what a great place, what a great democracy, what a great model for the rest of the world to see what democracy could look like. And so what I would say at this moment, Ken, is that the world is watching, and it's not seeing what I saw many years ago. I never, ever thought that we would get to this point. And I'm hoping that there's a way that we can turn around. And then the last thing that I will say is that a couple of weeks ago, we had one of our great alums on our campus, and that was Kermit the Frog. And you may see in that picture over there, a picture of me with Kermit. He was conceived here at the University of Maryland by Jim Henson. And as I sat on stage with Kermit, to a packed audience, there were people from across generations. There were grandparents there who were crying. There were kids there who were so excited. There were Black people, there were white people, there were immigrants, there were lots and lots of people. And I asked Kermit the same question in a different way. And Kermit said, at some point, we need to get back to a place where we can all get along, where we can really see each other for our humanity, for our shared humanity. And then he ended up singing the Rainbow Connection. And of course, the audience sang along. But I'll leave it there, because I think for a little girl growing up in West Africa, watching Sesame Street, I saw a world that was diverse and kind. And I was inspired by that. And I wonder if we can get back there. So I'll leave it there, Ken. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that, Stephanie. Raphael, you wanted to share a thought about the coming months ahead.
I think one of the things that we have all sort of agreed on throughout the course of the podcast is the idea that lived experience, nuances, whether they be cultural or whatever the case may be, do need to be taken into consideration rather than attaching, again, our entire notion of identity to whoever it is that we vote for. Because the truth is, when everything is said and done, we need to understand that our political parties are meant to represent ideas, policies, not who we are as people. So I know it's hard, and it's very, very hard, but in the coming days, in the coming weeks, if we can hold on to that distinction, we can have disagreements that don't define our relationships or communities. And I think that that's going to make us better role models for our students, for our kids. And again, I know it's not easy, but that's probably the best way moving forward so that we end up not tearing each other apart.
Yeah, well, you strike an optimistic chord, Raphael, and I appreciate that. And I hope you're right about that. I hope that this coming months is something that Kermit would be proud of and look back and say, "All right, we went through a difficult time, and but we ended up, for the most part, being kind to each other." And I think in some ways that's really at the heart of preserving our democracy. Jordanis, I'm going to let you have offer your thoughts, just a final thought, and then we'll come to Chris.
I think something that's been on my mind a lot recently with the coming election is that I'm hoping young people aren't demoralized to still be involved civically. I think a lot of times, well, not a lot of times, but specifically with this election in 2021, there has been a large emphasis on just the presidential election. And I haven't seen a lot of young people put emphasis on local elections or what's happening in their state. And I'm hoping that regardless of the outcomes of this election, that young people are still motivated to be involved in their local elections and in their states to make sure that the change that they want to see is actually happening. Because without getting involved on the local or state level, then this changes that they are hoping to envision aren't actually going to come true, because the presidential election at the end of the day isn't going to affect the large change that we want to see.
I'm glad you made that point, Jordanis, because I was at a bridging event in my community where people in the community came together to talk about local issues. And one of the facilitators in a group came up to me later and said, we had a spirited, vigorous discussion about development and a variety of other local issues. He said, I could not for the life of me figure out what political party people were in or connected to. And it was because at the local level, the same political leanings often don't play out in the same way. And people came away saying, we had a really good discussion. We listened to each other across party lines. We didn't even know what party affiliation was. And we began to come up with ideas about how we're going to address some of our community challenges together. And we agreed to work on these things together. And so your call for young people to get involved in local issues, and all of us, is a really nice way to think about how we can participate in our democracy. It's not all just national polarizing toxic politics. It's local issues where there's often a lot of common ground. Chris, how about a final thought from you about this?
Polarization is not new in the United States. The denial of people's humanity is not new in the United States. At this point, however, we should have learned and understood what happens when you have polarization and the denial of people's humanity, and understand what that does to our country and to our institutions. Right now, the enemy is not the person on the other side of the aisle. The enemy right now are the thoughts and the concepts that will undermine our democracy and our political institutions and proper civic engagement. And as we look to this election, we need to understand that the undermining of those institutions are far more damaging than losing the presidency for 4 years or losing Congress for 2 years. That's temporary. But the undermining of our elections and this division could very well be permanent. And with that said, that will fundamentally undermine all of those values that we hold dear, this idea of life, liberty, no matter what side of the political aisle that you're on. So when we're understanding this election, we all need to understand the concept that we're all supposed to be in this together. We are all supposed to be one united country, one United States, or else we are unfortunately sliding towards a future that will be all the worse, and we will be betraying all of the things we claim to be fighting for.
Well, Chris, with that, I think we'll leave it on that wonderful insight and a reminder. I'm always reminded when I have conversations like this that if people hadn't declared what their party affiliation was, that we on these conversations talking about challenging topics, race and history, how it should be taught, there's so much common ground that emerges, and that has indeed happened again today. I think we're all striving for the same thing. I appreciate the involvement of each of you in this conversation. So with that, I want to thank all of our listeners for tuning in to this episode. You can find this episode and all of our episodes of Courageous Conversations about our schools at schoolconversations.org or wherever you get your podcasts. So long, everyone.
Why are there so many songs about rainbows? And what's on the other side? Rainbows are visions, but only illusions.